Welcome to This Explainer. Right now, literally the whole world is holding its breath watching the 2026 US-Iran ceasefire negotiations. But while the daily news headlines are totally consumed by the immediate political maneuvering, we're going to do something a bit different today. We are going to unpack the incredibly complex, deeply rooted academic and historical forces that are actually driving this whole situation. I promise you, by the end of this explainer, you're going to see this conflict in a completely different light. So let's jump right into the central tension here. Is the 2026 US-Iran deal a breakthrough, or is it a dangerous illusion? On the surface, political leaders are taking a victory lap, right? They're touting this potential 60-day ceasefire as a monumental win. But when you look underneath that political rhetoric, geopolitical and security analysts are raising some really stark warnings. They see a trap. They see a temporary pause that completely ignores the deep structural flaws in this relationship. To figure out who's actually right, we're going to use an iceberg model. We'll start with the illusion of peace, dive down into realism and constructivism, explore the trap of holy war, look at the legacy of distrust, and wrap up with crisis management. All right, Section 1, an illusion of peace, the current crisis. So the current situation right now hinges on a proposed 60-day ceasefire that's being mediated over in Islamabad. But as Danny Citrinwich from the Institute for National Security Studies points out, quote, the enormous gap between the declarations made at the beginning of the campaign and the agreement that will likely bring it to an end illustrates its failure. This perfectly captures the alarm bells going off among Israeli analysts and security experts. They don't see the emerging agreement as a triumph at all. To them, it's a strategic failure. It's a political climb down that leaves the absolute core issue, the nuclear threat, completely unresolved.
Section 2, realism, power and deterrence, strategy and survival. Okay, so let's try to understand this through our first academic framework. Basically, realism tells us to imagine a world with zero rules. There is no world police, and because of that anarchic global system, states are absolutely forced to prioritize their own survival, hoard power, and maintain strategic autonomy. So if we look through this lens, international diplomacy isn't about morals, it isn't about right or wrong. It is fundamentally about military capabilities and self-preservation. When we apply that realist perspective directly to these two nations, the clash makes total sense. On one side, you have the United States. They prioritize regional hegemony, maintaining the balance of power, and intensely containing Iran's nuclear and missile capabilities. On the other side, Iran's absolute top priority is regime survival. For Tehran, maintaining nuclear ambiguity isn't just some bargaining chip at a table. It is a vital, existential deterrent against an external military attack. These competing security interests create a classic, terrifying security dilemma, because one nation's self-defense is literally seen as the other nation's threat. But, material weapons aren't everything. Section 3, constructivism, identity and history, the power of narratives. Constructivism acts almost like a decoder ring for this whole conflict. It teaches us that international politics is socially constructed. It is driven by historical narratives, identity, and shared meanings. Deeply embedded ideologies limit what diplomats can actually agree to, just as much as physical weapons do. Through this constructivist lens, we see some massive structural roadblocks standing in the way of a real agreement. First off, the legacy of Western colonialism and interference in the Middle East is huge here. Iranian political identity is fundamentally built around resistance to that exact Western imperialism. So, when right-wing populist politicians in the US push really aggressive foreign policies, the regional narrative often frames them as modern colonizers. This mutual framing turns both sides into existential, civilizational threats, which just completely stifles any real diplomatic progress. Section 4. The Trap of Holy War. Framing geopolitics as divine mandate. This brings us to a huge underlying reason why this conflict threatens to just go on forever. Listen to this profound warning from international expert Aza Karam. When such language enters strategic discourse, it transforms a political conflict into something far more dangerous, a war steeped in sacred meaning. There is an immense inherent danger when politicians and evangelicals take a standard geopolitical dispute over territory and power and reframe it as an apocalyptic religious battle. Think about this stark contrast here. A political conflict, even a really severe one, can theoretically be solved, right? You sit down, you negotiate, you compromise, you sign treaties. But a holy war? That is seen as a literal fight for divine truth. And when you're fighting for divine truth, compromise isn't just difficult, it's practically impossible. To the hardliners, negotiation is viewed as absolute treason. We can actually see this religious framing actively preventing structural solutions right now. Experts are tracking a real rise in U.S. Christian nationalist and evangelical apocalyptic rhetoric regarding the Middle East. At the same time, a global surge in Islamophobia reinforces this narrative of a massive civilizational divide. Add in the fact that international institutions like the UN have diminished power to mediate, and diaspora communities are being radicalized across borders, and you end up with an endless cycle. It just becomes this perpetual clash between anti-colonial resistance on one side and perceived holy war on the other.
Section 5. A Legacy of Mutual Distrust. A History of Broken Deals. To really understand the fragility of this 2026 ceasefire, we have to use past experiences to learn why diplomacy keeps failing. Mutual distrust isn't just some vague feeling here. It is a rigid, structural barrier built over decades of history. Back in 1953, a CIA-backed coup removed Iran's prime minister. Then, in 1979, the Islamic Revolution led to the U.S. Embassy hostage crisis, which deeply traumatized the American psyche. And fast forward to 2018, the U.S. unilaterally backed out of the painstakingly negotiated JCPOA nuclear agreement. When diplomacy fails this consistently, and these betrayals are etched so deeply into national memories, achieving true compromise today is almost impossible.
Section 6. Crisis Management, not Resolution. Why this deal is failing.
Let's analyze why experts universally warn that the current approach is completely flawed. Analysts like Sanam Vakil point out 4 distinct structural obstacles. First, that total lack of mutual trust we just talked about. Second, there's absolutely no direct contact between the parties. Relying on regional mediators just slows everything down. Third, a massive gap in needs. Iran wants concrete guarantees and sanctions relief, while the U.S. wants a quick, shiny headline. And fourth, the domestic politics in both Washington and Tehran are incredibly toxic, meaning any compromise gets instantly attacked as a surrender. Because of these 4 hurdles, this negotiation isn't a structural solution. It's just crisis management. This brings us to a massive divide between the politicians and the experts. The negotiators are desperately seeking short-term wins and headlines, but geopolitical experts are standing right there warning of structural flaws and ultimate failure. The negotiators are pushing hard for this 60-day pause, while the analysts are predicting an inevitable return to escalation. And here's the kicker. While politicians rely heavily on sanctions and blockades to get leverage, experts note that these exact tactics just deepen that intense anti-colonial nationalist resistance within Iran.
Sanam Vakil really hits the nail on the head here when she writes, the ceasefire has held just enough to prevent a total return to all-out war, but not enough to create peace. This is exactly why the deal is widely viewed by academics and security analysts as a political failure. It merely pauses the conflict. It kicks the can down the road, completely ignoring the economic pain and the nuclear ambitions, giving both sides a convenient opportunity to just reload. Which leaves us with this final thought. When you factor in the crushing legacy of mutual distrust, the structural barrier of completely opposite security needs, and that terrifying trap of framing geopolitical struggles as divine civilizational wars, we really have to ask ourselves, can true peace actually exist when diplomacy is literally just a pause to reload? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope this gave you a powerful new way to look at the headlines. Keep asking those tough questions, and I'll catch you next time.